Assalamu alaikum everyone. We are thankful to the hosts of the 12th Annual Muslim Mental Health Conference for organizing this event at such a challenging time during the pandemic. I wanted to come to Chicago in March, but the conference was postponed. Still, due to your commitment and hard work, you managed to arrange this conference online. Congratulations. I had personally dropped the idea of presenting my paper at this conference, but when Abdullah Rothman asked me to send a recording, I decided to talk on a topic that he helped me come up with. The title of my talk is Islamic Psychology, Field Construction, a look at the past and present. When we talk about this exciting and emerging field called Islamic psychology, I'm sure you would agree that this terminology did not exist in the history of social sciences literature. However, the equivalent term in Arabic, ilm an-nafs, did exist in the past and studied by early Muslim scholars within the field of Islamic philosophy. Additionally, if we search for psychological terms in the Quran, we find nafs mentioned 295 times, qalb more than 130 times, and ruh at least 24 times. Through these terms, the Quran conveys some very profound meanings about human nature. So we can say that while the term Islamic psychology is contemporary, the Quran introduced these concepts more than 1400 years ago. We are also aware how the early Muslim scholars, starting from the 7th century AD, or soon after the demise of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, until the 10th century, wrote extensively about human nafs and its manifestations and interplay with similar other entities within the individual self. The era of Muslims and their intellectual contributions expanded globally for more than 1,000 years, but around the 14th century, the Islamic sciences came to a halt for a variety of reasons, mainly because of the closing of the doors of ijtihad, or independent reasoning among Muslims. The closing of ijtihad obviously led to the freezing of knowledge from what was already known at the time and directed Muslims towards taqlid, or imitation of knowledge without reasoning. I will not get further into this topic because it is outside the scope of my talk, but the fallout from ending ijtihad stopped the Muslims to examine the existing knowledge from an Islamic lens. Many Muslim scholars now believe that the blind imitation of secular and borrowed knowledge resulted in young Muslims losing faith in their own civilization and cultures, that eventually caused an intellectual crisis in the Muslim mind. This is the backdrop of where Muslims, scientists, and scholars have been in the last several hundred years, and the psychologists are no exception. If we do a survey of Muslim psychologists today, we will see that most, if not all, are trained in the secular school of psychology. Islamic psychology is basically a new kid on the block. While Islamic psychology is trying to establish itself in some countries, Muslim psychologists and students are, in general, almost oblivious of their own intellectual traditions and the Islamic worldview of human nature. Malik Badri pointed this out many years ago, that Muslim psychologists are often more ardent supporters of secular psychology than the Westerners, and indicated in his informal conversations that if Islamic psychology were to take roots and become a formal discipline, it would most likely be spearheaded by Western psychologists who revert back to Islam. In my view, despite being generally secular, the Western mindset is more open to change. We know how multicultural psychology flourished in America, and the strength with which spiritual psychology and counseling has become more robust over the years. You may know that the head of the Division of Spiritual Psychology in APA, Thomas Plant, is now running for APA president. You may also know that Christian psychology has made deep inroads in the West, particularly in the United States. There are several established Christian psychology programs and grad schools in the US now, and all this resulted from the hard work of the supporters of this discipline. A prominent name in Christian psychology is Kirk Kilpatrick, who wrote the book Psychological Seduction: The Failure of Modern Psychology almost 40 years ago, in which he claims that despite modern psychology's growth over a century, there is a continued increase in crimes, divorce rates, drug abuse, and a general dissatisfaction with life in the US. He calls modern psychology antisocial because it is built on a theory of individualism and materialism. He is opposed to the idea of self-actualization because it is based on the notion of self-centeredness that cannot create or maintain a socially harmonious culture and is irrelevant for people who come from collectivistic cultures. For Kilpatrick, modern psychology is more in the business of prescription than description, and looks for solutions before understanding the problems, as it ignores the unobservable. Similarly, C.S. Lewis from Britain points out that modern psychology cannot answer the deeper questions. For instance, what he calls the inconsolable longing, which means that it doesn't matter how much of the world we possess, there's always a feeling of incompleteness or dissatisfaction from within. For Lewis, the problem with psychology is its incomplete account of human experience. Now, if we look at the religiosity surveys in the US, 95% of the people over 50 years of age classify themselves as religious, and 70% attend a church. For psychologists to ignore these spiritual aspects of human nature is a major shortcoming of the discipline. For me personally, this is utter negligence of an important element of human nature. These concerns by many psychologists over the years led to the development of integration of psychology and religion. Well, and then there is the case of William James and the entire history of how psychology was shaped by secular forces, which is another topic of discussion we can save for later. In the more recent past in the US, and also in other parts of the world, the development of multicultural psychology, spiritual psychology, and more importantly, the support for indigenization of psychology movements are precursors for many young Muslims to think about their own religious psychology based on the Quranic paradigm. With efforts from several individuals in the initial stages, and now from a larger group of people, we see serious interest in establishing Islamic psychology as a formal discipline. So where do we stand in terms of the integration of Islam and psychology? We know that Iqra is the first word in Quran, and the Prophet was asked not just to read, but also to comprehend and apply the Quranic injunctions in his daily life. The Quran is replete with the verses on pondering, reflecting, and applying that which is revealed in the Holy Book. So why did the Muslims never integrate Quranic verses and its concepts in the study of human behavior? Goes back to the problem of taqlid, of secular psychology. The secularization of psychology neglected the moral and spiritual phenomena within man and led to the development of theories that are deterministic and leave little or no room for human volition. The concept is contrary to the Islamic paradigm, where humans have substantial room for free will. The good news is that we now see a deep interest among some Western educated psychologists to critically evaluate the concepts and theories of modern psychology from an Islamic lens. and investigate the Islamic concepts of nafs, qalb, ruh, aql, etc., given in the Quran, a book of divine guidance for all humans. Knowledge integration between Islam and psychology is essential in at least 4 main areas. The course is taught: intrapersonal integration of the psychologist, integration in research, and integration in training. This model is basically the version used in Christian psychology programs in the US and can serve as a guideline to construct the field of Islamic psychology around the globe. So if we were to do course integration in Islamic psychology, we can think of courses on the concept of human nature in Islamic perspective, theological or theoretical foundation of Islamic psychotherapies, theological and psychological models of disorders, Islamic spiritual interventions for psychological disorders, cross-cultural issues in psychology and theology, etc. In the area of intrapersonal integration of the psychologist, we may look at training that addresses the issue of developing personal congruence between self and theology, that is, religious beliefs, faith, etc. I wrote a paper back in 1996 on the need for cognitive restructuring of Muslim psychologists before an endeavor into IP ever becomes possible. This would constitute a reflection on psychologists' own theological and psychological beliefs and discuss how one's own personality and theology could work in cohesion. In the area of research integration, the possibilities are of course endless. There can be studies on the challenges of developing an integrated mindset, research on religious growth in children, conflict resolution in an Islamic perspective, religion and positive youth development, spirituality measurement scales, religious coping in health-related matters, stem cell research, psychoethics, etc. In the area of clinical training, integration could take place in areas of religious-based assessments, religious-based therapies, supervision of students also from an integrated perspective, and integrated symposiums and seminars on a variety of topics. Dr. Malik Badri and I were invited in an IP conference in the year 2000 in Sydney, Australia, when I had proposed an IP course covering almost all of the above 4 areas of integration. But that effort was individual, preliminary, and never took off. The field of IP has made much progress in the last 20 years, and we have a lot more ideas today to work with. Keshavarzi and I published 2 research papers in 2013 and 2014 on integrating Islamic concepts and methods in therapy. We published again in 2017 with Khan and Rothman, highlighting the need for integration between Islam and psychology. Many points are covered in those papers that can be instrumental in constructing not just the courses, but all 4 areas I mentioned above. Badri's work on the dilemma of Muslim psychologists influenced me back in 1982 when I was a master's student in Michigan, followed by the environment in which I ended up at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, an institution that was created to Islamize knowledge. That too is another topic of discussion, because some scholars say that knowledge is already Islamic, and all you need to do is to sift the truth from the non-truth. This is a philosophical debate and outside the scope of my talk, but I was fortunate enough to have been in the midst of some very learned scholars in Malaysia, most notably Sayyid Naqib al-Attas, who wrote the book The Nature of Man and Psychology of the Human Soul. Islamic psychology field construction is much easier today than it was 20 years ago. Badri, as a pioneer of Islamic psychology, has written many books. Rashid Skinner was also one of the first proponents of IP and presented a paper in Malaysia back in the mid-90s. That paper found a place in one of my edited books on psychology of personality, Islamic Perspectives, published in 2005. Muhammad Yasin's book Human Nature in Islam is also helpful in understanding fitrah from Islamic perspective. Yasin is not a psychologist but a scholar and was also the co-editor of my book Psychology of Personality. Many excellent authors have published in a variety of peer-reviewed journals on IP in the last decade, peer-reviewed articles, that is, in different journals, international journals. Some important names, and these scholars are also my acquaintances, that include Carrie York Al-Karam on the definition and conceptual framework of IP, and her edited book on Islamic integrated psychotherapy, Rothman and Coyle's study on conceptualizing IP based on grounded theory, and another on framework for Islamic psychology, Paul Kaplik and Skinner on Islam and psychology movement, and Kaplik's brilliant bibliography of all the IP works published in recent history. There are many more psychologists who have published important works that are groundbreaking and will shape the field of Islamic psychology. I remember several religious-based psychological assessment papers published in 2 volumes of the Journal of Muslim Mental Health. All these contributions are excellent resource for field construction of Islamic psychology. One of my earlier papers, Contributions of Early Muslim Scholars to Psychology, was published in 2004 by the Blanton Peale Institute in New York. The Journal of Religion and Health was started by this institute back in 1961. Those familiar with the partnership and contributions of Blanton and Peale to the field of psychology and theology would know what I'm talking about. We also have a great number of emerging institutes, associations, and programs in many countries like the US, UK, Malaysia, Turkey, Pakistan, and India, to name a few. The IAIP, based in Turkey, offered limited scholarships of $1,000 to selected grad students doing master's thesis in IP-related areas. So there's obviously a continued effort in IP, which seems to be gaining momentum every year. Unfortunately, I do not know of any concerted efforts in the Middle East or the Gulf countries towards IP development, but there is some work at individual level in some countries. One of the problems is that while we have generated research at international level, not all materials are available in English language, and this constitutes a major barrier in IP field construction. I had this issue in mind for many years, and just at the start of this year, I came up with the idea of an edited book to see what efforts IP scholars and practitioners have made around the globe. I invited Abdullah Rothman to work with me on an edited book tentatively titled Islamic Psychology Around the Globe. And so far, we have psychologists from about 20 countries working on this project, which we hope to finalize by the end of this year, inshallah. This work will hopefully give us a bird's eye view on IP's growth, challenges, and prospects around the world, and help further construct a much stronger field for many years to come. With a team of like-minded psychologists and researchers determined and working hard to establish an independent discipline of Islamic psychology, it is only a matter of time when IP will find its proper place and recognition in the academia and clinical practice at international level. Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.